When it comes to covering the most important issue facing us and our Earth, one day does make all the difference. Now, the Weather Channel and its innovative climate team at Pattern are connecting you every day to the most fascinating stories impacting our planet. For what's now and what's next, rely on the climate experts with the most trusted name in TV news. If it's out there, it's in here. The Weather Channel.
Well, we now have Tropical Storm Ida. Tropical Depression 9 has now strengthened into Ida, and you might be asking yourself, wait a minute, didn't the 5 p.m. advisory come out, well, 20, 30 minutes ago? Why did they wait to make it a tropical storm 20 minutes later? It's because they're calling it like they see it based on the recon data. The satellite information, not crystal clear, but the recon data is. And so the advisory at 5 p.m. was a depression with 35-mile-an-hour winds. Now, based on the recon data, it's a tropical storm with 40-mile-an-hour winds. Otherwise, they don't have to do anything to change the 5 p.m. advisory because they were forecasting it to strengthen to a tropical storm. And it's, it's about in the same place that it was when they did the 5 p.m. advisory. So let's take a look at the track and intensity forecast again. So they were forecasting it to be a 65-mile-an-hour storm by tomorrow afternoon. So getting to 40 now is just along the way of a pretty steep intensification climb that we expect this to undergo. Now, let me show you how they determined that it's a tropical storm. This is from the Air Force C-130 that took off from Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi a little while ago, came down through the Yucatan Channel, and they went from south to north through the storm, kind of on the eastern side between the center of it and Jamaica, and that's where they found the strongest winds. Now, all of these winds are not necessarily believable from the step frequency microwave radiometer. They're looking at that instrument. They're also looking at the flight level data, but they've got some believable data there that's above that 39-mile-an-hour threshold, and that makes it the tropical storm. Now, this is the mission that's ongoing right now. And they'll stay out there for a little while longer, probably all the way till the intermediate public advisory in 2.5 hours. Then we're going to have the NOAA G4 jet overnight. Then the NOAA P3 and the Air Force will be flying into it tomorrow morning. And the closer this gets, the more frequent the missions will become. So this is the NOAA P3 that will fly into it tomorrow morning. This is a 4-engine turboprop. It's got propellers, flies into the system. Depending on where it is intensity-wise, that'll determine the altitude at which they fly. Now, this is the plane that just determined that TD9 became a tropical storm. Again, they flew from Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi. They have 10 of those actually at that base. Sometimes they forward deploy to the Caribbean and to Miami, other places. And they've been flying at a lower altitude, not at 10,000 feet, because it's a weaker storm. The stronger this gets, the higher they'll fly into a hurricane. It's 10,000 feet. Now, the G4 jet that'll take off overnight tonight flies around it at high altitude, like at 40 or 45,000 feet, and that will drop the SONs. It'll drop these guys, these drop SONs. Now, the G4 jet exclusively drops these SONs in the environment. The data are collected as this SON falls via parachute, collects temperature, pressure, moisture, and then it's tracked by GPS as it travels with the wind, and those data get into the computer models to make the track forecasts more accurate. Also, those Air Force planes, the C-130s from the Air Force, they drop these SONs also, but they'll drop them in the eye, they'll drop them in the eye wall, they'll drop them out at the maximum extent of tropical storm force winds. Mike and Alex, when I was a forecaster at the Hurricane Center, I was one of those mad bombers. I would tell them to drop as many of these things as possible, even though they're $800-900 a pop, but it's taxpayer money well spent. It's the only way to get winds inside the eye wall of a hurricane without actually being like at the surface in those winds.
I'm with you, Dr. Nab. Hundreds of dollars that could potentially save thousands of lives, save property. Why not?
Absolutely.
Right. Listen, we're talking trillions of dollars about other stuff, so a couple $100 is nothing, right? Dr. Nab, thank you so much. Great explanation of what's going on there. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about severe storms that are hitting us as well, and we'll get back to the tropics here in just a second. But how about this in Altona, Illinois here? Storms came through yesterday, and we're watching a threat again tonight. There are going to be similar areas that look for storms. Minnesota's going to be one of those targets. Iowa will be one of those targets. So just heads up on a really volatile August atmosphere right now. So there are going to be some spots here right through the heart of the country where Right now, it looks like conditions are favorable for storms to form. In fact, they already hit us in the Twin Cities today. The state fair is kicking off today. Boy, it's been just ripping through. But notice this area that's all highlighted in this bright red or the dark red color, the most likely locations to see severe storms this evening. Look at that little mezzo just spinning its way right over through Eau Claire. That's the one that hit us in the Twin Cities. But you can see the spin on that thing. I mean, that thing is amazing. And then you can see even a little bit of a purple in there, so a little bit of hail is still being pumped out of that, not to mention some good winds that may be just under the threshold of severe. Then you've got the storms here near Alexandria, headed towards St. Cloud eventually. Watch for those. Then let's go farther south now. So here we are in St. Louis. Not a lot happening right in the city, but storms pretty stationary just outside Lincoln and Warren counties with severe thunderstorm warnings. Alex?
Back to school forecast. How's Charlotte looking? Well, it's still warm, but we're going to be dry at those bus stop locations. Temps in the upper 80s on Friday, low 90s early next week.
This back-to-school forecast brought to you by Target. With lower prices, make Target your first stop back to school.
What we value most should be held in our hands.
Be prepared all across coastal Louisiana, and the time to prepare is now. We have a storm that will soon enter the Gulf. The Gulf is absolutely ripe.
That was Governor John Bel Edwards alerting his folks, his community, to get ready. We've got to watch this all along the Gulf Coast. So it's not just Louisiana, not just Mississippi, but really anywhere along the Gulf Coast you want to watch. Although, Mike, getting a little bit more and more confidence that we could be looking at one of those two states.
You know, the models haven't wavered a lot here over the course of the last 2 days or so. But one thing that the governor said there was the Gulf of Mexico is ripe.
Yes.
I mean, I think he is spot on with that. So let's bring in our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, talk a little bit more about Ida here and why the Gulf of Mexico is ripe, Dr. Knabb.
Well, it is almost always warm enough in the Gulf of Mexico waters to supply fuel for tropical storms and hurricanes, but it's above average, and it's really warm in the northern half of the Gulf of Mexico. But the fuel isn't enough. You need the traffic in the atmosphere to get out of the way, so to speak, and there's going to be really weak wind shear. So when you have a system that is organizing and headed toward warm water and weak shear, and it's this time of year, and we know historically how late August and the Gulf of Mexico can churn up some big hurricanes, then it's not a surprise that we're forecasting strengthening and rapid strengthening over the Gulf of Mexico. Just recently, last few minutes, Hurricane Center upgraded Tropical Depression 9, that was at 5 p.m., to Tropical Storm Ida because they got the data from the hurricane hunters to measure that, to confirm that. The satellite estimates, when it's at this stage, are not very clear, but the aircraft data are far more clear. This is an Air Force C-130, took off from Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, came through the Yucatan Channel, and went from south to north on the stronger presumed side of the storm between the center and Jamaica, and found winds, surface winds above that 39-mile-an-hour threshold. Now, not all of these peaks are valid. There are some challenges with this particular instrument that's plotted here, but they've got flight level winds and they can sift through all of that, and their estimation is that the max winds are at 40 miles an hour. So that's in this area, just north, west and west of Jamaica. Cayman Islands are over here, and so this is the wet side of the storm. A tropical storm is almost by definition lopsided. I mean, usually it doesn't have banding all the way around. That's when you make the transition into a hurricane. But there's some pretty concentrated convection. We could have over a foot of rain in some of these Caribbean islands that could cause flooding, and mudslides could be a big problem. Winds are not a big deal on land. Yeah, it's been gusting to 32 Kingston and on the east side. But this will be ramping up over the very warm waters of the Northwest Caribbean and only spending a little bit of time over the landmass of western Cuba. And here's the surface high pressure that's helping steer it to the northwest. You got the very warm waters of the Gulf. Look at the northern half of the Gulf. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of fuel there. It's like fuel injection for hurricanes. It's not just warm water at the surface in the Gulf and the western Caribbean. It's deep warm water. This upper level low is getting out of the way. The wind shear is going to be weak. You got mid-level high pressure. It's going to be steering it to the northwest. That high is over here. The steering currents are very well defined, and you have rapid intensification forecast by the Hurricane Center. 110 miles an hour. That might not be where it stops. Could it get a little stronger than that? It absolutely could. Tropical storm warnings are still for the Cayman Islands and western Cuba. Alex and Mike, I think watches go up for the northern Gulf Coast tomorrow morning because the winds of tropical storm force probably arriving Sunday morning.
All right, Dr. Neb, great detail there. Really appreciate that. And, you know, we might be going into a very surge-prone coastline here because it can be very shallow, low shelf here. And so that just allows the water to pile up here. All these areas that are shaded in orange, Louisiana, coastal Mississippi, into Alabama, and then the panhandle of Florida as well. So when you take a look at this, surge-prone areas where your elevation is below 10 feet, highlighted in yellow on this, and look around Pascagoula. Look how far inland it's flat, right? All the coast here of Mississippi. You remember what happened with Katrina around Bay St. Louis and Long Beach and Gulfport, and tens of thousands of people will be at risk over around Mobile. And we can extend that way up past Mobile, but Gulf Shores really vulnerable. Pensacola Beach, very vulnerable. 42,000 homes in this area and a population of 50,000 people that may need to get out of harm's way. And then you take a look at what the wind speed forecast is here. We could be looking at an expanding system, an intensifying system here. Look at the wind field here. So larger systems tend to produce more surge. Intense systems tend to produce more surge. We may be doing both of those things. Right front quadrant hit right in here, the highest storm surge, and right in those places we just showed you. Alex?
Got much more ahead, including New Orleans has a plan to keep the rainfall from the storm from flooding the city, but is it enough?
Whatever gives you life, there's a Life Cuisine.
Named the world's most accurate forecaster, the Weather Channel.
Welcome back into Weather Underground. If you are just joining us, we have now Tropical Storm Ida, newly designated here within the last 20 minutes or so. This currently with 40-mile-per-hour winds moving to the northwest at 14 miles an hour. And as we move through the end of the week and into the weekend, we're going to watch this take a course right into the Gulf of Mexico. And we are looking at very likely a Louisiana, Mississippi landfall at this point. And that would be late this weekend, early next week. So pressure is at 1,006 millibars. This is 100 miles to the west-southwest of Negril, Jamaica. We are looking at this working over the Caymans. It's going to skirt the eastern, or rather western tip of the island of Cuba. So we've got time before this makes it into the Gulf, but we don't think this is going to have much in the way of land interaction. Instead, going to move into the Gulf, get full advantage of the very favorable conditions when it comes to intensification. And so, Mike, we are anticipating intensification. You can see the National Hurricane Center forecast 80 miles an hour on Saturday afternoon to 110 miles an hour by Sunday afternoon.
All right, Alex, thank you so much for that. To New Orleans we go. We're in the cone, and so obviously there's going to be a heightened awareness of what could be coming our way, especially with a forecast of rapid intensification. We know in New Orleans we can be very vulnerable to all the different aspects of a hurricane, from wind to storm surge to rainfall flooding. We talked earlier here on Weather Underground, one of the big issues there is the pump system that's designed to keep the city from flooding. It does have some limitations. So joining us right now is Kelly Chandler, Regional Director of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. Thanks so much for being with us. You maintain the system there and decide, you know, what is done with that, Kelly, when the time comes. Can you explain to our viewers at home how it works, what your concerns would be with something like Ida approaching?
Yeah, we start monitoring the storms when they're way out in the Gulf. We get storm surge predictions from the National Weather Service. We work closely with our partners at CPRA, the Corps of Engineers, and local and state officials. And based on the storm surge predictions, we start closing off the city and closing gates and preparing for the storm.
Now, Kelly, with a system that could, one of the scenarios is that the system comes in west of New Orleans, and that could, you know, bring a significant storm surge into southeast Louisiana, but also it might be relatively slow moving and drop a lot of rain. Are there pros and cons or things you have to weigh to get rainwater out while also not letting the storm surge in?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for here in New Orleans. The longer the system sits over us and the more rain we get, the more challenging it is to get the rainwater out of the city and drained into the lake and into the Gulf. So we prefer a faster moving storm. But either way, we are ready for the storm. We have one of the most technically advanced storm protection systems in the world, and we are ready and are confident that the system will perform as designed.
It's a great system. Do we get to a point, though, where there could be too much water? At what point does it become a problem, even for the system?
It does get to be too much if the rain drops faster than the city can pump. But most of the time, the city will start pumping down ahead of the rainwater, and we will close off the cities to protect it from any storm surge.
Kelly, it's not an all or nothing, right? Like you can do certain parts of the city and not others, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. We close off the city based on what the predictions are and which way the storm is expected to make landfall, which side of the storm we're on, and so we can adjust accordingly.
And Kelly, could you explain to folks why it's called a hurricane risk reduction system, which I think is intentional, meaning it doesn't eliminate flood risk inside those barriers, right?
That's correct. No system can absolutely eliminate all risk, but the system is designed to prevent or reduce the risk down to a 1% chance. That means that there's a 1% chance each year we could have a 100-year storm. And so it is never down to zero, but it is greatly reduced since Hurricane Katrina. They've made amazing improvements in the system, and it's ready to go.
Well, Kelly, it's great information. It's an amazing system, and hopefully it's going to help the city of New Orleans quite a bit when this system comes to call on. So thank you so much for being with us. Kelly Chandler with the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. And we also know that there's going to be certainly a lot of rain. I mean, that's almost a foregone conclusion at this point, right? You take a look at what the forecast is here. Heavy rain that comes right through Louisiana, even outside of New Orleans. There'll be vulnerable locations from Baton Rouge to Lafayette, over toward Alexandria, all the way up to potentially I-20 and beyond, by the way. That's the European model. Take a look at the GFS model. It's a little bit farther east, but still you get the flavor here. Very heavy rain coming up through Louisiana and Mississippi. This model, however, does have a big bullseye on New Orleans, where you could get double-digit rainfall totals here, which could potentially overwhelm the system. But also notice here, big rain that goes over toward Gulfport and Mobile and Pensacola, and then well inland. We've got very saturated soil here as well, so big rain on top of that does not help matters right now. And a close-up view here, 5 to 6 inches of rain forecast here in New Orleans, most of that happening around landfall time. Alex? And
still to come on Weather Underground, the time to get ready for Ida is narrowing and narrowing quickly. So hurricane expert Dr. Knabb is here to look at where the models say it's headed and what's steering it.
Well, a terrifying landing in the middle of a thunderstorm that does not go as planned. Here's a sneak peek at how Mayday air disaster unfolded.
After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up.
Put it down! Put it down!
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 90 miles per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
Coming up right after Weather Underground, it's Mayday air disaster.
That looks terrifying. Due to recent weather events, of course, Henri, Tennessee flooding, and now Ida. We've had to postpone the final round of our Waste No Water Challenge. I know, but Mike has a little bit more time to practice, but we can tell you collectively our meteorologist has saved almost 8,000 gallons of water by just changing some daily habits. And now we're down to our final two, Tevin Wooten and Mike Bettis. Yay! Both Tevin and Mike have reduced their water by 47%, dramatically changing their day-to-day lives, cutting back on everything from laundry and dishwasher use to toilet flushing, which we here at Woo can definitely vouch for. Each of them has also saved a lot of water indirectly by going completely vegan. Amazing. Well, as soon as we get you safely past Ida's threat, the Waste No Water Challenge will resume. And from what I hear, me and Mike are going to carpool to save some water. All right, now we want to get you back to Ida. Of course, our hurricane expert, Dr. Nab, watching that closely.
Yeah, this became a tropical storm about a half hour ago based on aircraft reconnaissance data, and this is just the beginning of a strengthening trend as it moves northwestward over the very warm waters of the northwestern Caribbean. And over the next day or two, life-threatening heavy rains, flash floods and mudslides, Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, portions of Cuba, maybe getting over into Mexico if it were to get far left enough. It's going to be a water problem even while it's a tropical storm over the Caribbean. Probably doesn't become a hurricane until the Gulf of Mexico, but that doesn't mean it isn't dangerous already. Look at all that deep convection in Jamaica on the wet side of it right now. Conditions deteriorating in the Caymans and in Cuba. The wind is not a big deal on land yet, but there are tropical storm warnings up for the Cayman Islands and the western third of Cuba. And there's surface high pressure here just off the east coast of the U.S., and that's stacked up into the mid-levels of the atmosphere. That's why it's being steered northwestward into the Gulf of Mexico, where the waters are especially warm, in particular the northern half of the Gulf of Mexico. So once it clears the western end of Cuba, rapid intensification is a very distinct possibility over the warm water because upper level high pressure is starting to take hold as this upper level low gets out of the way. Unfortunately, all the ingredients are coming together for an intensifying system that could, as soon as it gets into the Gulf, not long after that, become a hurricane and maybe a major hurricane before it comes ashore sometime in the PM hours on Sunday. And then this is not a fast moving system. Less than 10 miles an hour from Sunday to Monday into Tuesday. It will be an inland wind event. It will be an inland rain-induced flood event, and it always brings the risk of tornadoes, the landfalling significant Gulf Coast hurricanes. Now, because the winds of tropical storm force are likely to arrive by Sunday morning, pretty early, and maybe if it speeds up and the wind field expands, maybe as soon as Saturday night, it's possible that hurricane and storm surge watches could come up for some portions of the northern Gulf Coast of the U.S., maybe later tonight, and if not, then tomorrow morning. So we are getting into that time frame where we're in the watch time frame, and then maybe tomorrow night it could be in the warning time frame, and we've only got less than 3 days to prepare for this. And I want to highlight, too, why this is not only going to be a wind event, an inland flood event, but a storm surge event. This is going to be a growing system in horizontal size. And, Mike, as you showed earlier, this is a very vulnerable part of the Gulf Coast. Evacuations almost certainly going to be called for a lot of people.
About an intensifying storm and a growing storm. This is a bad scenario. Dr. Nab, thank you. Coming up next, Tropical Storm Ida. It's not only just about where it's headed, but how strong it gets. All those details in our next hour. Well, next on Weather Underground, a significant threat to the Gulf Coast, and it's just days away as a tropical storm heads to the northern Gulf. Right now, all signs pointing to an intense hurricane by the weekend. Everyone from Texas to the Florida Panhandle needs to prepare with just a couple of days to get ready, and we are breaking down all of the possible scenarios. Our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Nab, is here. He's going to show exactly when and where this system could make landfall, plus why rapid intensification is a near certainty.
And southern Louisiana will likely be drenched with heavy downpours that could lead to dangerous flash flooding, making a vulnerable city like New Orleans a sitting duck. The elaborate pump system in that city, it's designed to pump rainwater out, but it has its limitations. We're going to talk to those tasked with making the difficult decision to keep the floodgates open or closed. Those stories and more right now on Weather Underground.
Hi, everyone. Glad you could be with us here for Weather Underground. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson. As you mentioned, our hurricane expert, Dr. Nav, in the house as well to break down everything you need to know about Tropical Storm Ida. Mike, this one, really no doubt at this point, this is headed our way.
It is. Something gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it has to make a landfall. So the question is, how intense will it become and how big will it get? What will the impact be to especially the northern Gulf Coast? Well, let's take a look at what's going on with Ida right now. Within the last hour, the Hurricane Center making this a tropical storm, winds at 40 miles per hour. You can see there is some spin happening right in here in the Caribbean. Cuba, just to the north of it here, northwest movement at 14 miles per hour. So it's getting its act together right now. The Cayman Islands as well as western Cuba are under tropical storm warnings now, and this is likely to come over both of these locations, then reemerge out in the Gulf of Mexico. We'll have no land interaction then until an eventual landfall. The hurricane hunters are out there right now. They're just now beginning their mission. We're going to get some very valuable data this evening, and I think this point going forward will pretty much be nonstop data. So we're going to be on it, folks, and I think we're going to get really good fixes on this, observations, knowing exactly what the wind speeds are, and potentially really honing in on the forecast locations of this. The forecast actually hasn't wavered all that much over the last 2 days or so. Maybe a slight shift east, but not radical by any means. There's a look at the forecast going over Cuba into the Gulf of Mexico, intensifying, and by a Sunday afternoon, evening, we're on the precipice of a major hurricane. This is a strong high-end Category 2. Could it go higher than that? Certainly, but you can see Louisiana, Mississippi are in harm's way. So let's bring in our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knapp, for some details on this. What's going to steer it? What's going to change its intensity, Dr. Knapp?
Yeah, unfortunately, the steering currents are pretty well defined. So I don't see any way that this does not get into the Gulf of Mexico and make landfall somewhere as a significant hurricane. I don't see any way out of that. You got surface high pressure here near the east coast of the U.S. That's pretty stacked up into mid-level, so that's going to steer this northwestward into the Gulf of Mexico. And when you look at the really big picture, there's upper level low here. It's getting out of the way. Upper level high pressure is going to be overhead, and that means weak wind shear. And then you just got middle to upper level high pressure here. And then there's another player. There's a trough over the northern Rockies that's going to be moving eastward, and that's going to weaken the ridge over the central part of the U.S. and the Gulf Coast. That's going to open up a path for this system to get northward. So let's take a look at that in the model. So the colors, that's the low-level spin of the tropical storm. Here's the solid white lines of our subtropical high that's going to steer it this way, and then you see a gap in that ridge. Here comes that upper-level trough. And as you play this forward, that high just sits there right near the east coast. So the steering currents toward the northwest into the Gulf of Mexico, very well defined. As you get into Saturday, it's over the middle of the Gulf. Now, here's that high pressure that has moved a little bit more centered, a little bit more on the east coast of the U.S. There is that trough that is weakening the ridge and keeping that door open to come ashore in the United States. So it looks very unlikely that it would come ashore in Mexico, as models a couple days were suggesting. And then you've got this trough departing and another ridge at high levels building in, and so there's not going to be a trough digging down to scoop it up and take it away quickly. So once it arrives in the northern Gulf Coast around Sunday, it doesn't move out as fast as we would like. I mean, you want to get tropical systems in and out, because the longer they stick around, the longer the winds, the longer the storm surge, and the heavier the rains and the bigger the flood risk. So that's a slow mover from Sunday to Wednesday in the GFS. Now, let's take a look at some alternative scenarios in the GFS modeling system. That's the main run that I just showed you, but there are ensembles. There are alternative scenarios. You tweak the initial conditions a little bit, and you see what kinds of other scenarios are possible. There are plenty of tracks to the left, and there are tracks to the right. So you can't even guarantee that the center comes ashore in Louisiana. Mississippi is a possibility. Near the Texas-Louisiana coast is a possibility. So don't take the middle of the cone and draw a line and say that's definitely where it's going. These are the main runs of the main U.S. models, but you know, the ensembles are what to look at there. Here's the European model, the main run, same main player, the high pressure over the East Coast, still going into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's high confidence it's getting into the middle of the Gulf. And you see upper level, those dotted lines, upper level high pressure overhead, weak wind shear. The Euro is a little bit slower in the forward speed compared to the GFS, so we can't pinpoint the timing of landfall. But like the GFS, it doesn't move all that fast Sunday, Monday, Tuesday into Wednesday as it comes ashore in the southeast. So we're going to have an inland wind rainfall event. And this plane right here, the NOAA G4 jet, is going to do a mission overnight tonight and do 2 missions a day. That's dropping the dropsondes to try to get those models into better agreement and make the track forecast as accurate as they can be. But guys, the time of arrival of winds of tropical storm force is early Sunday morning, maybe as early as Saturday night. And so when you look at the models, not just the track and intensity, but the size of the system, this is a big time storm surge risk, and storm surge watches along with hurricane watches could come out later tonight or early tomorrow morning. And I can't imagine there aren't going to be a lot of people that aren't asked to evacuate.
Absolutely. And officials in Louisiana, they are already, of course, closely watching this storm. They know all too well what a storm in the Gulf is capable of. And today, Louisiana's governor said the short amount of time between now and the expected landfall, even the impacts, also reason for concern.
Understand that the Hurricane Center and the meteorologists are very concerned about this storm because they see all the conditions necessary for it to strengthen very, very rapidly. And we don't have a 5, 6, 7 day advance notice where we would do all of our H-hour sequencing across the state of Louisiana, working with all of the local officials and so forth.
And Dr. Knapp, although there's a short time between now and when we anticipate those effects and landfall, we think there's still plenty of time for this to really intensify.
Yeah, and the evacuation question and storm surge have a lot to do with the intensity forecast as well as what the size of the system is going to be. And, you know, for a long time, we have taken the intensity forecast near landfall and add a category to that, and that's what to plan for. So I'm sure that emergency managers are at least planning for Category 3. And when the storm surge watch goes up later tonight or tomorrow morning, then you'll get all the storm surge products, and that will provide even more guidance for evacuation decision makers. Now, here again is the tropical storm, and it is already got a lot of concentrated thunderstorm activity. It's lopsided on the east side. There's a little bit of departing wind shear from that upper level low. But generally, tropical storms aren't wrapped all the way around. So this has the look of something that's poised to strengthen. And there will be a little bit of land interaction with western Cuba, but the storm's not going to feel that all that much. And once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico by tomorrow night, then unfortunately, it's probably off to the races with intensification. And look at how much warmer the northern Gulf is, even compared to the southern Gulf. So there's a tremendous amount of fuel in those warm, shallow waters. And because the storm and eventually the hurricane will be moving along, it's not going to have time to churn up the cool waters from below. And the waters here and in the southern Gulf are deep, warm water. So you just keep churning up more warm water. So here's that upper level low getting out of the way. Here's the upper level high pressure. So warm water and weak wind shear and a storm that already has some decent structure to it. And that's why the Hurricane Center is explicitly forecasting rapid intensification. And when they do that, it's not something they do lightly and don't do every day. That means they've got higher than usual confidence of significant strengthening. And any intensity forecast, you can't just take that number and say, okay, it's going to be a Cat 2 at landfall. Could it be stronger than the 110? You get to 115, you're at Cat 3. And rapidly intensifying hurricanes, and if this becomes one, major hurricanes, sometimes have a mind of their own with how strong they can get under the right conditions. So we have to, Mike and Alex, expect the unexpected with this and be ready to make changes to our plans in a short amount of time.
Absolutely. And things we need to think about right now, of course, wind, one of the factors that we think we will be dealing with, as Dr. Knabb just said. This thing may intensify even farther than what the National Hurricane Center forecast says right now. Rapid intensification on the table. Hurricane winds. We want to cover our windows with shutters or plywood. You do not want to tape your windows. Waste of time actually makes it more dangerous. Shelter like you would for a tornado. So put as many walls between you and the outside as possible. Don't stay in a mobile home. Don't stay on upper floors of a high rise. So if we're looking at the New Orleans metro area, you don't want to be on the, the 15th floor of an apartment building or a condo complex, because then you're going to actually be dealing with the stronger winds. Consider leaving any unsafe structures as well, any unsafe areas, or maybe you feel like your home just isn't that sturdy and you don't trust it in those strong winds, then you want to go to one of those hurricane shelters. When we look at the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, we are forecasting again to be in that high-end Category 2 range, knowing that it could be even stronger than that. So looking at the possibility for extensive damage, with even the chance that we get ourselves even into some more destructive territory when it comes to those wind speeds. When we look at potential wind damage compared to a Category 1 hurricane, take a look, 50 times greater in a Category 3 storm. So it doesn't just go up a level, it increases exponentially. Mike?
For that, and we know that one of the other components that comes along with this is going to be water, right? And rainfall flooding could be a serious issue for us. You take a look at a place like New Orleans, vulnerable to storm surge, vulnerable to rainfall flooding. Places like the French Quarter, sometimes just in thunderstorms, we can see some water into the streets here, let alone a landfalling hurricane. All right, so what could that mean for us when Ida comes calling? And we think that that might be almost a certainty at this point. Let's bring in our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, again, talk a little bit more about this, because of all the places that are vulnerable, Dr. Knabb, and this could aim very close, if not right over New Orleans, where we maximize the rainfall. That's bad news.
It is, Mike. And as Alex just did, we're legitimately concerned about damaging and life-threatening winds, and you got to shelter for that. But this part of the U.S., the northern Gulf Coast, is one of the most vulnerable locations to storm surge in the country. And with how much rain we've had this year, it is set up as one of the most vulnerable to rain-induced flooding. And some places could be at risk for both. So we're going to have a lot of water to deal with, both saltwater and freshwater, in part because this is going to be a slow mover. From Sunday into Monday into Tuesday, this is moving less than 10 miles an hour if this forecast is right. And that's a part of the cone and a part of the advisory that doesn't get as much attention. But think about the number 8. That's a bad number. It might be moving about 8 miles an hour. That's not real fast. That's going to allow the storm surge to build up and last longer, the winds to last longer, and the rain to last longer. That really ramps up the rain-induced flood threat, and not just in these coastal cities that are going to be very vulnerable to the saltwater and the freshwater flooding, but look at how far inland significant rains could go. These are global models kicking out a large volume of water all the way up through Mississippi, portions of Alabama. It might eclipse Arkansas, up into Tennessee. This will be an inland event. And again, once the wind and the rain start, that's also about the time that storm surge will be starting, and we need to be out of areas that are told to evacuate. And look at this GFS depiction here, Mike, for on Sunday. That onshore flow into that shape of coastline with the beginning of the rain that could last a couple days. We have some big-time water concerns for New Orleans and a lot of the northern Gulf Coast, and it starts in just a little over 2 days.
So, Dr. Knabb, let me ask you this then. So, I mean, we're going to try to you said we got to shelter from the wind, but we've got to evacuate people from vulnerable locations, right?
Oh, yeah. You've got to evacuate from water and then shelter from the wind. I mean, that's a phrase that's often been used, but the main way to survive storm surge is not be there when it happens. And with inland flooding, you want to stay off the roads and don't shelter in really flood-prone areas near rivers and so forth. But then you got to shelter from the wind. So, yeah, you have to plan ahead and think through what your plan is for where you're going to shelter during the the storm so you're out of the water and safe from the wind.
This can get really complicated for lots and lots of people, Dr. Knabb. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's talk specifics about New Orleans then, because as Dr. Knabb was showing us, we've got vulnerabilities, right? So let's give you a close-up view of what the rainfall forecast could be here in New Orleans. And we might maximize some rainfall here. You can see this forecast is 5 to 6 inches of rainfall for us here. So what that means is our pumping system is going to be maxed out. And a lot is going to happen the day of landfall in itself, then move its way inland here. So if you take a look at the unique situation that New Orleans is under here, a lot of the city sits below sea level. And so as rainwater comes in, you know, natural drainage by gravity through our storm sewers doesn't take it up and out. So you have to pump it out. And so we have a flood risk mitigation system here where we got to pump the water up and out into the Mississippi or to Lake Pontchartrain here. And what we can do is we can actually evacuate 1 inch of water per hour for the first hour. After that, though, the pumping system doesn't have as much capability, only ½ an inch per hour up to 5 inches. If the forecast is 5 to 6, we're going to be right on the edge of what the flood mitigation system can do. More details on Ida right after this.
This program brought to you by Maomi Wines. Flavor forward.
This Labor Day, celebrate hardworking heroes everywhere.
I've said it once and I'll say it again. I love my job.
With a week-long marathon of some of the most extreme, intense, and dangerous jobs out there.
If this breaks, I'm a dead man.
Featuring your favorite shows.
This business is blood, sweat, and tears.
Hot diggity!
Don't you want this job?
Don't miss Workin' Hard Week, starting Labor Day, only on the Weather Channel.
All right, if you are just joining us, a lot to watch in the tropics. Most importantly, newly designated tropical storm Ida on a collision course really with the U.S. Gulf Coast. Looking at later this weekend, but as early as Sunday morning, we begin to feel the impacts from this along sections of the U.S. Gulf Coast. So we're going to be watching parts of the state of Louisiana and Mississippi right now, but other areas along the Gulf Coast need to be watching this one very closely. So we give you a look at the storm and where it is going. When we look at the wind shear, there is very little in its way. So we have high confidence that this is only going to strengthen once it gets into the Gulf waters. Very little shear, very warm water, two very important factors when we talk about what's going to allow a storm to strengthen. And again, continuing that beeline to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Again, more likely that we're looking at Louisiana, perhaps Mississippi, eastern Texas most certainly in play. But our forecast models all in pretty good agreement that we are looking at landfall later this weekend, late this weekend, I should say, into portions of the U.S. Gulf Coast, mainly Louisiana. Could be looking at significant impacts in a place like New Orleans, but then moving not overly quickly. So heavy rain continues inland for places like Jackson and Memphis early next week. I want to head over to Dr. Knabb for a little bit more in the way of analysis. Of course, Dr. Knabb, we talk about storms in the Gulf and what a danger they can be. Yeah, and that's why it's so important for the hurricane hunters to be at the ready and flying into these systems for you and me. This is an Air Force C-130, and after an ironic weather delay this afternoon, sometimes at their place where they're taking off, that's where they have the weather problems. They took off from Biloxi, Keesler Air Force Base, and they fly into what has now been named Tropical Storm Ida because of the data that they collected.
That's how it was determined that it was a tropical storm, not based on the satellite estimates, which are more uncertain at this stage if it's 35 or 40 miles an hour. It is the data from the hurricane hunters, the flight level data, and the SFMR, the stepped frequency microwave radiometer instrument that it uses remote sensing to measure the surface winds. And the combination of those data, the hurricane specialists at Hurricane Center determined the max winds are at 40 miles an hour. And this is where they took off from, Keesler Air Force Base, Biloxi, Mississippi, traversed the whole Gulf, went through the Yucatan Channel, went from northwest to southeast. And then on this leg, when they went north between the center and Jamaica, that's the stronger side of the storm. That's where they found the winds to make it a 40-mile-an-hour storm. They have since gone to the southwest side, but they're not done. They're in the weaker part of the storm right now, but they'll go back in. Now, not all of these peaks are valid because this particular instrument that's plotted here from the SFMR, that is susceptible to some rain contamination. And when you're near land like this, the waves can be contaminated by the shallowness of the water or the interaction with land. So the foaminess isn't all due to the wind, but you can sort through that by looking at the flight level winds too. But it might be, based on the recent data, getting closer to 45 miles an hour, but the Hurricane Center will digest the data from this mission for the next hour and a half, and we'll get an intermediate public advisory at 8 p.m. to update you on what the aircraft is showing based on their interpretation. But it's forecast to strengthen more as a tropical storm in the Northwest Caribbean, a little bit of land interaction, and then, unfortunately, probably going to strengthen quite a bit over the Gulf of Mexico. And to try to get this track forecast as accurate as possible, they're not only going to be flying planes from the Air Force and NOAA into the storm right now and tomorrow morning, but they're going to fly the NOAA G4 jet around the system, and that's going to be happening overnight tonight. So this is the P3. This is the NOAA plane that goes into the storm, but that is something that is going to be flying tomorrow morning. Hasn't flown into Ida just yet. But then here's the plane, the next one that flew into the storm a little while ago, the Air Force C-130, that determined that this is a tropical storm. They got 9 others, so we have quite the armada to monitor this as it goes over the Gulf of Mexico. Mike?
Now, we're going to have, basically at this point, going forward, nonstop flights, right, into Ida. How vital is that in helping determine the forecast?
Oh, my gosh. Especially in the potential rapid intensification scenario, it is critical that the Air Force and NOAA are going to be flying into this nearly continuously once it's in the Gulf of Mexico.
And as far as, I mean, in either, we look at the Air Force, right? They're flying more of the observational missions, right? And then those high altitude planes are doing more of, would ultimately be doing more of the forecasting that would come out of this, right?
Yeah, so that plane there in the middle, the NOAA Gulfstream 4 jet, that's the one that flies high altitude around the storm. It's going to fly a mission early tomorrow morning. It'll do 2 missions per day, drop in those sondes, try to get the track forecast more accurate. But then the NOAA P3 on the left, the Air Force C-130 on the right, they will nearly continuously be flying into the storm over the Gulf. And Alex, we need those data to see just how fast this is strengthening.
Yeah, really, really valuable stuff. So we appreciate those men and women who are out there on those all-important flights. We've got much more on Ida coming up on Weather Underground, including how vulnerable the Gulf Coast is.
Be prepared all across coastal Louisiana, and the time to prepare is now. We have a storm that will soon enter the Gulf. The Gulf is absolutely ripe.
That was Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards helping prepare the residents of his state for perhaps yet another landfall. We had a big year last year in 2020, and now as 2021 Atlantic hurricane season really ramps up, we have Ida looking to make a collision with parts of the U.S. Gulf Coast.
I mean, seriously, Louisiana, 4 strikes last year, right? And this could become calling now. Thanks for being with us alongside Alex Wilson. I'm Mike Bettis. We've got a lot to talk about tonight when it comes to Ida. Let's bring in our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knapp, for the very latest. What could be a serious threat to the northern Gulf Coast here, Dr. Knapp?
Yeah, it sure could, Mike and Alex. And didn't the governor put it well? The Gulf of Mexico is ripe. It is loaded with fuel, unfortunately, and the atmosphere, unfortunately, also is going to cooperate with the storm with weak wind shear. So with a storm that's already gathering organization here between the Cayman Islands and Jamaica, it's going to strengthen some even before it crosses western Cuba. And then once it gets in the Gulf of Mexico, no land interaction until final Gulf landfall. Super warm waters and weak wind shear. And the steering is such that not only the surface here where you see the high pressure near the East Coast, but it's stacked vertically. It's going to be steering it northwestward into the Gulf of Mexico. No doubt it gets into the Gulf, and there's no doubt that the northern half of the Gulf of Mexico, the sea surface temperatures are extremely warm. Also, you have the warm eddies here in the southeastern Gulf. There's very, very deep warm water in the southeastern Gulf coming out of the northwestern Caribbean and then feeding into the Gulf Stream. So there's just no lack of fuel in the Gulf of Mexico and the northwestern Caribbean. Here's our upper level low getting out of the way, upper level high pressure at the very highest levels there. Sitting on top of it, and that's going to be the weak wind shear that allows it to significantly strengthen. And it's not all that often the Hurricane Center explicitly forecasts rapid intensification once it becomes a hurricane. On this forecast, sometime on Saturday, well, I hope it doesn't become a hurricane faster than that. But then on Saturday and Sunday, I don't think we're going to like what this thing does. It is going to likely strengthen steadily, if not quite rapidly, and it could be worse than this. It could be stronger than 110 miles an hour. Could be a Cat 3. Could be a major hurricane when it comes ashore. And then I don't like the end of the cone anymore because this is slow motion as it is moving inland, and this will not just be a coastal event. Now, you can't just look at the timing of when landfall the center is going to be. The winds will arrive before that, and it could be early Sunday morning that the winds of tropical storm force arrive if it stays on the current track, intensity and size expectations. But if it goes a little bit faster and the wind field expands, it could be even Saturday night that those tropical storm conditions start arriving. And it's 48 hours before the arrival of those winds that the hurricane watches go up and the storm surge watches go up, because even for storm surge, you got to have evacuations and other preparations done before the tropical storm winds get there. You don't want to be driving around evacuating when those winds arrive. So hurricane watches and storm surge watches could go up later tonight or tomorrow morning. And I want to highlight the vulnerability that we have due to storm surge. Here is the European model depiction. This is for Sunday morning. This would already be bringing the tropical storm force winds on shore and starting the onshore push, the storm surge. The GFS is even faster. So you could imagine if this is Sunday morning that the tropical storm conditions could have started on Saturday night and then into this shape of coastline. That is a very significant storm surge risk. And then you move it forward with the Euro model. Even after it comes ashore, you're going to have tremendous onshore push on the east side. So storm surge could extend well to the east of where the center comes ashore, and a very nasty rip current risk on the Florida Panhandle, even if you don't get storm surge there, Mike.
You know, Dr. Knabb, I want to ask you this. You know, we put so much into this cone. We all, look at it, every single model run, right? But it's not gospel, right? The reality is that Ida is about 1,000 miles away from, say, New Orleans. We can't say precisely where the landfall location is going to be.
No, we can't. And we looked at the GFS ensembles earlier. Some are to the left all the way over to near the Texas-Louisiana border. Some are to the right all the way to the Mississippi-Alabama border in terms of where the center could go. And the cone isn't the whole story. The center and the track line aren't the whole story. This will be a pretty large system when this comes ashore, and it will be an inland system. So, Mike, we really pay attention to those watches when they come out tonight or tomorrow morning, because that will start to outline who's at risk for the wind, who's at risk for the surge, and then the inland flood problem I'm really worried about, too.
We're just so vulnerable to so many aspects of this storm, unfortunately. You mentioned the surge there, Dr. Knabb. I want to show people why we're so vulnerable here along the northern Gulf Coast. Is because we end up having a very shallow shelf up near the coastline here. So from coastal Louisiana all the way through the Panhandle of Florida, very susceptible to high waves and then wave action on top of that, just eroding the beaches. For places like coastal Mississippi, 44,000 people at 10 feet or below. Obviously, evacuations will be needed.
Named the world's most accurate forecaster, the Weather Channel.
I want to get you caught up on the very latest tropical storm Ida, and this one's speeding up. Earlier this week we were looking at a potential landfall early next week. At this point, looks like we're going to begin to see impacts and feel impacts along the U.S. Gulf Coast as early as Sunday morning. Right now, a 40-mile-per-hour tropical storm moving to the northwest at 14 miles an hour, but confidence is there that this is a storm that will strengthen as it makes its way off to the northwest, eventually headed towards the Louisiana, Mississippi Gulf Coast by by the end of the weekend. You can see by tomorrow evening, looking at a strong tropical storm, Category 1 hurricane by the time we get into late Saturday. But late Sunday, we're going to be on that cusp of Category 2, Category 3. This, according to the forecast, knowing the conditions in the Gulf could lead to rapid intensification. You want to be prepared if you're in this area for a stronger storm. So beware of that potential. And then moving inland, we've got a storm that's not moving overly fast, so could drop some heavy rainfall rates inland in communities as well. So flash flooding most certainly a concern. There is that earliest, or rather most likely arrival time for the tropical storm force winds, and portions of the Louisiana coast could begin to feel that by Sunday morning. Mike?
To New Orleans we go. We're in the cone, and so obviously there's going to be a heightened awareness of what could be coming our way, especially with a forecast of rapid intensification. We know in New Orleans we can be very vulnerable to all the different aspects of a hurricane, from wind to storm surge to rainfall flooding. We talked earlier here on Weather Underground. One of the big issues there is the pump system that's designed to keep the city from flooding. It does have some limitations. So joining us right now is Kelly Chandler, Regional Director of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. Thanks so much for being with us. You maintain the system there and decide, what is done with that, Kelly, when the time comes. Can you explain to our viewers at home how it works, what your concerns would be with something like Ida approaching?
Yeah, we start monitoring the storms when they're way out in the Gulf. We get storm surge predictions from the National Weather Service. We work closely with our partners at CPRA, the Corps of Engineers, and local and state officials. And based on the storm surge predictions, we start closing off the city and closing gates and preparing for the storm.
Now, Kelly, with a system that could, one of the scenarios is that the system comes in west of New Orleans, and that could, bring a significant storm surge into southeast Louisiana. But also, it might be relatively slow moving and drop a lot of rain. Are there pros and cons, or things you have to weigh to get rainwater out while also not letting the storm surge in?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for here in New Orleans. The longer the system sits over us and the more rain we get, the more challenging it is to get the rainwater out of the city and drained into the lake and into the Gulf. So we prefer a faster moving storm. But either way, we are ready for the storm. We have one of the most technically advanced storm protection systems in the world. And we are ready and are confident that the system will perform as designed.
It's a great system. Do we get to a point, though, where there could be too much water? At what point does it become a problem, even for the system?
It does get to be too much if the rain drops faster than the city can pump. But most of the time, the city will start pumping down ahead of the rainwater. And we will close off the cities to protect it from any storm surge.
Kelly, it's not an all or nothing, right? Like you can do certain parts of the city and not others, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. We close off the city based on what the predictions are and which way the storm is expected to make landfall, which side of the storm we're on. And so we can adjust accordingly.
And Kelly, could you explain to folks why it's called a hurricane risk reduction system, which I think is intentional, meaning it doesn't eliminate flood risk inside those barriers, right?
That's correct. No system can absolutely eliminate all risk, but the system is designed to prevent or reduce the risk down to a 1% chance. That means that there's a 1% chance each year we could have a 100-year storm. And so it is never down to zero, but it is greatly reduced since Hurricane Katrina. They've made amazing improvements in the system, and it's ready to go.
Well, Kelly, thanks so much. Well, let's talk a little some more specifics then about what could happen for us here in a place like New Orleans and some other locations, because these rainfall forecasts are really important here to show you your threat. So New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Macomb, Biloxi, we're in that 4 to 5, 6 inch range as far as rainfall goes. And it may depend on the forward speed, how much we get. Will it be a little bit less than that? Will it be spot on? Will it be more? We can't tell you specifically what that's going to be, but as of right now, it looks like a pretty big rainfall forecast. For a place like Mobile or Gulfport or Pensacola, we're talking 3 to 5 inches of rain here. And as you go inland, we've had some significant rain here as well, 3 to 4 inches as we go north of I-10. And then you take a look at a place like, say, a Lake Charles or a Beaumont or Lafayette. If we're on the western side, we might get a little bit less, so maybe a 3 to 5 around Lafayette, but 1 or 2 inches from Lake Charles to Beaumont, which is much more manageable. Alex?
All right, still to come on Weather Underground. The time to get ready for Ida is narrowing quickly, so our hurricane expert, Dr. Nab, looks at where the models say it's headed and what's steering it.
Well, a terrifying landing in the middle of a thunderstorm that does not go as planned. Here's a peek at how Mayday air disaster unfolded.
After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up.
Put it down! Put it down!
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 90 miles per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point, that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
Next, right after Weather Underground, it's Mayday air disaster.
Well, due to recent weather events, Henri, Tennessee flooding, now Ida, we are postponing the final round of our Waste No Water Challenge. But we can tell you that collectively our meteorologists have saved almost 8,000 gallons of water by changing some daily habits. We're now down to our final two. It's Tevin Wooten versus Mike Bettis. And both Tevin and Mike reduced their water by 47%. They dramatically changed their lives, cutting back on everything from laundry, dishwasher use, toilet flushing, and each of them has saved a lot of water by going vegan. And as soon as we get you safely past Ida's threat, the Waste No Water Challenge will resume. So, Mike, you can do laundry this week.
Deal. Because I'm tired of buying new shirts all the time.
Yeah.
Well, we know the parishes in Louisiana are already taking the necessary steps today to get their residents ready for Ida. People living in St. Landry and Plaquemines and St. Tammany parishes, also Terrebonne Parish, and are now doing self-serve sandbag locations. So here's the deal. If you need sandbags, check with your local county, your local parish there, I should say, for the limits, how many you can take, all the details, then bring your own shovel and manpower. You may need that. Don't forget the pickup truck. But sandbagging could be very, very vital in a situation like this. Let's bring back in Dr. Nab, talk a little bit more about all things Ida here, Dr. Nab. And a lot of people will probably be sandbagging in the days ahead.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm going to focus first on the rain-induced flooding because that is going to be a big part of the story. Yes, the wind is a problem. could be life-threatening and damaging. Yes, the storm surge is a life-threatening hazard, but rain-induced flooding is a big, big issue, even with a tropical storm, because Jamaica, Cayman Islands, portions of Cuba could get over a foot of rainfall. Could be life-threatening floods and mudslides down there even before it becomes a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. And then once that happens, and once it gets stronger and grows in horizontal size and then slows down when it gets to the northern Gulf Coast of the U.S., we're going to have big-time water problems, storm surge flooding at the coast and going inland for some distance in some places, and then heavy, heavy rainfall, not just at the coast, but moving inland as well. This is the part of the cone, of course, that we're all concerned about in the U.S., not just because it could be 110 miles an hour near that Cat 2 or 3 threshold and may be stronger, and that could come ashore as a major hurricane, and not just because it's going to produce wind, it's going to produce storm surge, especially on the right-hand side of wherever the center comes ashore, but also this is a slow motion. This is only moving at about 8 miles an hour. From Sunday into Monday into Tuesday, that's really going to rack up the rainfall totals. Take a look at what the global models are kicking out. It doesn't mean they've got the path exactly right, because this is track dependent, but look at the Euro, how much heavy rain goes inland from Louisiana, Mississippi, southern Alabama, in through Arkansas, much of Mississippi into Tennessee. GFS track, which is a little farther east, still has southeast Louisiana getting a boatload of rain, but moving inland over much of Alabama, just farther to the east. And that rain is going to start along with the winds of tropical storm force, most likely on Sunday morning, but it could, if it speeds up, wind field expands, start on Saturday night, and that's when you got to be ready for the storm surge, which will be maximized on the right-hand side, whether it's the Euro or the GFS. This shape of coastline is extremely vulnerable. Mike and Alex, evacuations are going to be called. You got to go when they say go.
100%. Now, thanks so much for that. We hope you can stick around. We've got another hour to go here on Weather Underground. Why Ida is likely to not only intensify in the Gulf, but do so rapidly, and why forces that normally hold a storm back just aren't in play. That's coming up, top of the hour.
When you're
Next on Weather Underground, a significant threat to the Gulf Coast. It's just days away as Tropical Storm Ida forms in the Caribbean. And right now, all signs are pointing to an intense hurricane by the weekend. Everyone from, say, Texas to the Florida Panhandle needs to prepare with just a couple of days to get ready. So we're breaking down all of the possible scenarios. Our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, is breaking down exactly where and when it could make landfall, plus why rapid intensification is a near certainty.
And southern Louisiana will likely be drenched with heavy downpours that could lead to dangerous flash flooding, making a vulnerable city like New Orleans a sitting duck. The elaborate pump system in New Orleans designed to pump rainwater out, but it has its limitations. We're talking with those tasked with making the difficult decision to keep the floodgates open or closed. Those stories and much more right now on Weather Underground.
Hey everyone, thanks for staying with us. You're watching Weather Underground. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson. We've got a lot to talk about tonight in regards to newly designated Tropical Storm Ida. If you were with us last night, you're thinking, goodness, it's here, and we think, Mike, it's only going to strengthen here in the short window before it makes landfall.
Yeah, that's the whole key here too, Alex. Short window. We don't have a whole lot of time to react to what could be coming our way here, because Ida's going to intensify pretty quickly here and may really ramp up to an intense hurricane. As of right now, a 40-mile-per-hour tropical storm. We'll get another advisory later on this evening. Northwest moving at 14 miles per hour, and the thing is, the planes are going to be flying pretty much nonstop missions into this, so we're going to have a really good idea of what it's doing and how the forecast can be fine-tuned. As of right now, tropical storm warnings in effect for us in the Cayman Islands and the western end of Cuba. Now, as I mentioned, the planes are out there flying right now. We're going to get constant missions from them throughout this because of the threat that it does pose. Doing some crisscross right now, and as they are sampling the atmosphere in and around it, it really gives us a better idea of what the system will be doing, especially once it starts to intensify, which is anticipated throughout basically its lifespan at this point. You take a look at the forecast cone here, pretty narrow short term here. It's going to be pretty quick movers, slow down a little bit getting into the Gulf of Mexico, and look where it's aiming for. Northern Gulf Coast, Louisiana, and Mississippi right now in that forecast cone, and forecast to be a high-end Category 2. So let's bring in our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, for some more details on this. Dr. Knabb, what's steering it, what's intensifying it?
Yeah, and I am afraid that it's possible it could be stronger than Cat 2 when it makes landfall on the northern Gulf Coast. We'll explain why in just a little bit. Right now, the center's between the Cayman Islands and Jamaica, and for the time being, while wind might not be the biggest problem, heavy rainfall and life-threatening flash floods and mudslides are possible in Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and Cuba as this strengthens over the northwestern Caribbean Sea. Cayman Brock has already been gusting over 40 miles an hour, and that will be getting stronger as they get onto the stronger side as this moves northwestward. And it'll be going over the landmass of western Cuba, but I don't think that's going to slow this system down intensity-wise very much as it's steered by not only surface high pressure, but deep level high pressure over the western Atlantic. It's going to take it into the Gulf of Mexico where the waters are warm. They're extremely warm at the surface in the northern Gulf. They are warm to some depth here in the southeastern Gulf of Mexico. The loop current feeding into the Gulf Stream. There's a warm eddy down there. It's just got lots of fuel to tap into, and that, along with the weak wind shear that is starting to take over overhead, just all the ingredients are there for rapid intensification over the Gulf of Mexico. And once it leaves western Cuba tomorrow night, it will have, a little less than 2 days over the Gulf of Mexico, but that's plenty of time, unfortunately, for it to rapidly intensify. The Hurricane Center doesn't usually forecast this much strength. Look, going from 80 to 110 miles an hour from p.m. Saturday to p.m. Sunday. And that's just when the landfall of the center will occur. But the winds will start arriving before that. The expectation is that winds of tropical storm force would start arriving on the northern Gulf Coast Sunday morning. But if this speeds up a little bit, the wind field expands as it strengthens, it could be Saturday night. So we might only be a little more than a couple days away from winds of tropical storm force arriving. You got to have all your preparations done, your evacuation, your supplies, be in your safe place for the storm by that time. So if you want to be sure you're ahead of the game, plan to get all your stuff done by after dinner Saturday, including evacuation. So if you haven't been told to evacuate yet for storm surge primarily, which there's going to be a storm surge watch and a hurricane watch later tonight or tomorrow morning. Then there's going to be some evacuations. Where do you go? Decide now where you would go if you're told to go. That's what you can be doing now while you wait for possible evacuation instructions. Your best option is a friend's home who's not in an evacuation zone. And if you're not in an evacuation zone, you need to be planning with someone to be their evacuation destination. Especially, it's good to stay at somebody's place if they have backup power, if you need it for a medical device, if they will accept pets. A lot of shelters will, but friends, more likely to do that for you, and you don't want to evacuate vertically in a high rise. Mike and Alex, when I see an intensifying hurricane that could also be getting large and to this shaped coastline in the northern Gulf Coast, how vulnerable we are to storm surge there, there's going to be evacuations. And when they tell you to go, you got to go, because with a rapid intensification situation, evacuation instructions could change quickly.
Absolutely. You don't want to wait until the morning of, find out it's strengthened significantly, and now you really have to go. And the officials in Louisiana are watching this storm very, very closely because they know all too well what a storm in the Gulf is capable of. Today, Louisiana's governor said the short amount of time between now and the expected landfall also gives them reason for concern.
Understand that the Hurricane Center and the meteorologists are very concerned about this storm because they see all the conditions necessary for it to strengthen very, very rapidly. And we don't have a 5, 6, 7 day advance notice where we would do all of our H-hour sequencing across the state of Louisiana, working with all of the local officials and so forth.
And Dr. Knapp, it's important to note, you talk about evacuations. We've seen this happen with other storms. People, they tend to want to wait, but if you are being told to evacuate for a Category 2, there's still a chance it could intensify before it makes landfall, so you don't want to wait until it's too late.
That's right, Alex. And this kind of scenario can challenge a lot of preconceived notions. It can challenge a lot of assumptions. It can challenge a lot of plans. And this is why I want to emphasize here why we're so confident that it's going to rapidly intensify, why the Hurricane Center is forecasting what they are and what that means to you. And this is one of those scenarios where you cannot tune out. It is going to be a changing situation, and the faster this intensifies, depending on when, what you're told to do where you live and what you need to do could change very, very quickly. And the big players in the atmosphere are lower to middle level high pressure in the western Atlantic that's steering it into the Gulf of Mexico. And then this trough here is going to aid in weakening the ridge over the Gulf Coast states, and that provides an escape route for the system out of the Caribbean and then out of the Gulf of Mexico. So if you look at the models, here's our mid-level high. That's the solid white line. The colors, that's the low-level spin. And these dotted lines, upper level high pressure overhead, and that's weak wind shear. So that high right off the outer banks there is going to steer it into the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to clip western Cuba. That isn't going to do much to slow down the intensification rate. Plus, it has a couple days over the Gulf anyway. So here we are on Saturday about this time. There's the high parked over the mid-Atlantic, steering it northwestward. There's upper level high pressure in the dotted lines, no wind shear, and here's that trough coming into the northern plains that keeps this part of the ridge weak. And that means the door is open to come into the U.S. Remember a couple days ago, we had models that were suggesting it might form farther south and maybe go into Mexico? Well, look how much that has changed. But now that it's got a well-defined center, now that it's a storm, and now we got a pretty good beat on the well-defined steering currents, confidence is unfortunately very high of a strengthening hurricane over the Gulf coming to the northern Gulf Coast, making landfall sometime on Sunday. And it won't be all that fast of a mover because this trough, again, will be departing. Here comes in a ridge to kind of slow down the steering currents. There's not a big trough to pick it up and accelerate it northeastward. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday into Wednesday, what's left of it just isn't moving very fast. So that's a big problem too. Now, we can't pinpoint the timing or location of landfall. That's the main GFS run, but there are alternative scenarios. It's called the ensembles. Some of them are to the east, over to Mississippi, even Alabama. Some go as far west as maybe the Texas-Louisiana border. So landfall location is not certain, and that ultimately does determine where the worst storm surge is. But when you're forecasting it, you're probably going to see a storm surge watch cover a large area because we don't know who's going to get the core of the storm, who's going to get the maximum onshore push, storm surge, and wind. Now, the Euro is similar in the big picture, but it's a little different. It's a little bit slower in forward speed. It's a little bit farther to the west, but the overall scenario is the same. So, Mike, Alex, I'm very concerned about all the hazards that a hurricane, possibly major hurricane coming to the northern Gulf Coast can bring. By Saturday night or Sunday morning, we've got to get ready for the wind, the storm surge, the rain-induced flooding, and the tornado threat.
Yeah. Let's start with the wind and what do we need to think about right now? Well, first, you want to cover those windows, shutters or plywood. Do not tape the windows, waste of time, or makes the windows break into larger pieces. So then you've got more dangerous pieces of glass flying around. Shelter like you would for a tornado. So you want to put as many walls between you and the outside as possible. Don't stay in a mobile home if you are forecast to be in that zone. And also don't stay on the upper floors of a high rise. I think this is always a little bit of a confusing thing because people think going up is better to be away from the water. However, as you go higher up, you're then more vulnerable to the elevated winds, which are usually stronger, Consider leaving any unsafe structures and going to those storm shelters. When in doubt, just evacuate. Again, have that safe spot already lined up. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a relative, maybe it is one of those storm shelters. Make the preparations, make the accommodations for pets as well right now. Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, we're looking at a category 2 right now, which would get us to extensive, but knowing it's most certainly on the table that we could be looking at a stronger storm. So you can see as the scale goes up, so does the damage. Category 3 and 4 get you into that devastating catastrophic range when it comes to damage. So you want to prepare for the worst when you are doing these storm preparations. And when we look at the potential wind damage compared to a Category 1 hurricane, you can see Category 2 damage 10 times worse, Category 3 50 times worse. So Mike, it doesn't just go up one increment, it's exponentially worse as those hurricane winds increase.
Yeah, we're really watching what can happen with this as it intensifies. We're taking a look right now at New Orleans behind me. Maybe as soon as tomorrow we go under watches for Ida approaching here. And one of the threats that we'll certainly experience here is going to be wind. Another one is going to be storm surge. Another one is going to be rainfall flooding here. So let's break down some of the water threats here with our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, again, because it is one of those cities, Dr. Knabb, that's just so flood prone.
Incredibly flood prone, and it's a problem on the northern Gulf Coast in the big picture where you're vulnerable to both saltwater flooding because of the shape of the coastline, especially in here, and the shallow Gulf water. So you're very vulnerable to storm surge. But especially right now, this year, we're more vulnerable than usual to rain-induced flooding because how wet of a year it has already been. That sets the table for more vulnerability to heavy rain. And also, when the soil is moist like that, it's easier for trees to get blown down. So it's never good to have a wet year leading up to a hurricane landfall. Then you throw in that this is forecast to be a high-end Cat 2 or maybe stronger, a major hurricane at landfall. Major hurricanes tend to be pretty solid from front to back, right? You get rain for the first half and the second half. It's not going to be as lopsided as, you know, a tropical storm or something like that. But it's also going to be a relatively slow mover, not going to stall necessarily, but it's going to be moving less than 10 miles an hour from Sunday into Monday into Tuesday as it comes ashore. That will really ramp up the rainfall total. So you can imagine, you know, in the coastal areas, while you've got tremendous storm surge to the right of wherever the center comes ashore, and you've got heavy rainfall, and you're trying to drain that water back into the Gulf of Mexico, you could really get some serious flooding, even in some places, from a combination of fresh water and saltwater flooding. And then look at the European model and the GFS, how much rain they bring, how far inland, all the way up into Tennessee, which I know we don't want to see happen to anybody, never mind places that have gotten too much rain up in Tennessee recently. And all of this is going to start probably on Sunday morning, maybe as early as Saturday night. And Mike, when I see a system that looks like this, you know, a big system, a slow mover, a strong system, big storm surge producer, big rainfall induced flood producer, it's all on the table for this one.
When everything is in play, that's really, really tough, including really vulnerable locations, too. That's a real tough pill to swallow, Dr. Neb. Thank you. So let's talk more about New Orleans because it is such a vulnerable city. We know that. You take a look what the rainfall forecast is here, and there's really a bullseye at this point for southern Louisiana and right into New Orleans with a 5 to 6 inch rainfall forecast, all right? And that's, I know that up here it says that's a 3-day forecast. Most of that's going to happen in probably 1 day or less than that. But that's going to pose a very serious threat to New Orleans because of how the city is oriented, right? It's basically below sea level. And so when the water goes into the storm drains, rainfall flooding, when that goes into the storm drains, it doesn't let gravity take over and it flows out into the ocean. It has to go up. It has to be pumped up and then out in order to keep the city dry. And so a majority of this area being below sea level works against us. However, after Katrina, what they ended up doing was kind of redoing the entire flood mitigation system there. So they have the pumps that remove the water. But here's the deal. Those pumps can only remove 1 inch of rainfall for that very first hour of rain. After that, they have reduced capacity to ½ an inch per hour, up to 5 inches total here. So with a rainfall forecast here, Alex, of 5 to 6 inches, this system could really be tested.
Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up in the show. Well, still to come on Weather Underground. We're also talking about the hurricane hunters flying right into these tropical systems. So what are they doing on these bumpy rides and why is it so important? We'll give you a look at the different missions of each flight and the info we get from those.
This program brought to you by Maomi Wines. Flavor forward.
Curiosity pushes you forward. It's what inspired Maomi to create an unrivaled...
When it comes to covering the most important issue facing us and our Earth, one day does make all the difference. Now, the Weather Channel and its innovative climate team at Pattern are connecting you every day to the most fascinating stories impacting our planet. For what's now and what's next, rely on the climate experts with the most trusted name in TV news. If it's out there, it's in here. The Weather Channel.
We are very closely watching Tropical Storm Ida, designated earlier today, and we think this is on a strengthening path and one that takes it right into the U.S. Gulf Coast. So there are other things in the tropics, but Ida, of course, the main concern and the real threat here moving into the end of the weekend. So let's break down the details for you. Again, 40-mile-per-hour winds with this one. Again, this was designated earlier this afternoon as one of our recon flights got some of that information to show us this had strengthened, this had organized into a tropical storm. Currently moving to the northwest at 14 miles an hour, and that northwest motion is one that will continue here through the end of the week and into the weekend, and that puts it really on a course that designates a Louisiana, Mississippi landfall as we head towards the end of the weekend. We can begin to feel the impacts, though, along portions of the Louisiana coastline as early as Sunday morning. So the time to prepare truly is now. You can see our forecast models in pretty good agreement. And one of the things that helps our forecast models is the information we get from the hurricane hunters, Dr. Nab, that also allows us to determine the strength, as we saw earlier today.
Yeah, and isn't it ironic, too? These planes can fly into major, even Cat 5 hurricanes, but if there's bad weather on the ground, they might be delayed. So ironically, they were delayed from taking off from Biloxi, Mississippi today, Keesler Air Force Base. But that Air Force WC-130 flew into what was Tropical Depression 9, even up to 5 p.m. And then based on data from that very plane, it was upgraded to Tropical Storm Ida just 2 hours ago. The satellite estimates what the intensity is, but the aircraft provide, kind of taking the storm's temperature, whereas the satellite is just kind of, the doctor just kind of looking at you. You look kind of sick. Well, you send in the plane, it takes your temperature. No, you do have a fever. That's kind of what the plane does. It gets inside the storm to really diagnose what's going on, and that's why the max winds are set at 40 miles an hour. And here's the path that plane took, went across the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel, and they've been doing multiple passes. So they went northwest to southeast, then on that south to north path on the east side, that's when they found the tropical storm force winds. And I think they're going to make another trip over to the stronger northeast side before they're done. So still getting winds close to that tropical storm threshold, but they're not in the strongest part of the system right now. Now, we need planes to fly into the storm to monitor the intensity, especially with a rapid intensification scenario. The nearly continuous flights into the storm will be critical to monitor intensity changes, but also we need to get that track forecast as accurate as we possibly can. That's what the NOAA G4 jet mission overnight tonight will be for, but the NOAA and Air Force planes flying into the storm will be critical. So that NOAA P3 plane is going to be flying into it tomorrow. They take off from Lakeland. One of the benefits of being there is it's a short trip into the system, and the stronger the system gets, the higher they'll fly. Strong tropical storm might fly at 5,000 feet. Full-blown hurricane, they might fly up at 10,000 feet. Same for the C-130. This is one of the 10 such planes the Air Force has that flew into what became Ida just a couple hours ago. And then, of course, the other plane is the really fast, high-level NOAA G4 jet. This doesn't go into or directly over the storm. It goes around it at high altitude, drops those sondes, try to get the data into the models and make for a better track forecast. So we have quite the luxury in this part of the world to have this kind of data and the brave men and women to fly into the storms. Mike and Alex?
No question. What a luxury, but also what should give us a lot more confidence in our ability to observe and forecast these. That's why we've gotten so good at it recently, too. Dr. Nab, thanks for that. Want to show you some interesting sights today out of Washington, D.C. Check this out.
When thunder roars, go indoors.
Oh, wow, right? Yes, when thunder roars, go indoors. That's the Marine Sentry standing outside of the White House, and just so proper, so casual. Right in he goes, like, yep, I'm not having any part of that lightning. And he barely flinches. Like, he does just a little bit. But I got to tell you, wow, nerves of steel. Well, that guy, right? Well done, sir. Well done. But with some big storms that came right over Washington, D.C. We've got still some storms here across the mid-Atlantic. I want to show you the big blow-up that we had here in D.C. I'm going to take you back to earlier. It was around, say, 4 or 5 o'clock, where, boom, the storms are coming right over top of us. Tons of lightning. And, of course, it would scare anybody when you get that close of strikes, right? Storms all across the mid-Atlantic right now. A couple of severe thunderstorm warnings, but we've also got big storms that are firing for us in the Midwest tonight as well. A lot of severe weather is popping for us right now. Storms about to come into Minneapolis. Be our second round today, hitting us in Buffalo down toward Hutchinson right now. Storms down through Waterloo. Not severe thunderstorm warnings, small hail with those storms, and a big line of storms here just north of St. Louis as well. Be prepared to stay inside tonight and watch for lightning and hail.
When you're shopping for a new vehicle, how do you know which brand you can trust? With Subaru, you get Kelley Blue Book's most trusted.
Be prepared all across coastal Louisiana, and the time to prepare is now. We have a storm that will soon enter the Gulf. The Gulf is absolutely ripe.
That is Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards telling the people of his state time to prepare is now. Mike, we are looking at the window for preparation really closing as that northwestern motion going to continue right into the weekend.
Yeah. I think that was really key here, what he said. The window of opportunity here is closing, right? And people probably, Dr. Nab, are thinking, well, this thing's in the Caribbean. It's only a tropical storm right now. Really, what do I have to worry about? But if they aren't paying attention, if they aren't preparing now, they're going to find themselves in a world of hurt.
And that's why we have forecasters, right? You got to focus on what it is forecast to be, not what it is now. But Mike makes a very good point. You know, social scientists have done research to show that people tend to focus on what the current intensity is, and they gauge what they're going to do about it based on how strong it is now. But you can't take that strategy in this case, because if it rapidly intensifies all the way up into northern Gulf landfall, it might not be at a category that really worries you until it's on top of you. That's what the danger of rapid intensification up to landfall can bring. So we got to focus on the conditions that make it so high confidence that this is going to rapidly strengthen from what just became a tropical storm 2 hours ago to what could be a major hurricane. This high pressure at the surface and stacked up from there is going to steer it into the Gulf of Mexico, no doubt about that. And the governor put it very well about how ripe the Gulf of Mexico is now. It's pretty much always warm enough to support tropical storm, hurricane, and even major hurricane formation in the hurricane season. But right now, maybe just a little bit more oomph in the Gulf than usual. The northern half of the Gulf has very warm sea surface temperatures, but it's not just about what's going on at the surface. It's very deep warm water in the Northwest Caribbean, and then when that water comes up from the Caribbean, it does this loop current, you leave warm eddies around, flows into the Gulf Stream. If the warm sea surface temperatures are gas for the car, then this is like fuel injection. Or if you like electric vehicles, the sea surface temperatures might be a level 1 charger. This is a level 2 or a level 3 charger. Once it gets off of Cuba, it's going to be going over extremely warm water and deep warm water. That, combined with the weak wind shear, with this upper level high pressure building in over it, it's just got everything working for it, except a little bit of a stay over western Cuba. That's not going to slow it down much. And even after that, it has, you know, a couple days nearly over the Gulf of Mexico, which is unfortunately plenty of time for it to strengthen. The Hurricane Center doesn't usually forecast something from 80 miles an hour to 110 miles an hour in one day. But that shows you how confident they are that it's going to rapidly strengthen. And they would tell you, too, if you're forecasting a high-end Cat 2, you better plan for the possibility that it's a little stronger. Look, just as much as anybody, I hope it's weaker than what is forecast. But we have to plan for the possibility that it's stronger than that. And you can't plan for timing, Mike, based on when the center's going to come ashore. You got to plan for when the winds of tropical storm force are expected to arrive. Could be Sunday morning, could even be late Saturday night. And look at this big area at risk for wind. Hurricane watches, storm surge watches, probably coming out tonight or tomorrow morning.
You know, think about the surge too, Dr. Nab, is with that landfall location, you know, everyone on the east side is going to be surge prone here, and those are really vulnerable locations. Could be, you know, somewhat similar to other hurricanes that made landfall here. I think something like a Katrina. This could be a different animal, but you know what I'm getting at here.
A combination of saltwater flooding and freshwater flooding, because a large, slow-moving, intense hurricane is going to push a lot of salt water toward this very vulnerable coastline. But once the rain starts, Mike, I hope it only lasts for a day. The rain could last for longer than a day in some spots.
Yeah. And then worried about truly even inland. I'm worried about what places maybe north of I-20 could even get into here, being far away from the landfall location, right? Dr. Nev, thanks. Great stuff there. Always appreciate your analysis. But let's talk a little bit more about the vulnerable coastline here, because we are very surge prone here. Why? Because we have a very shallow shelf here. In this location from coastal Louisiana, coastal Mississippi, Alabama, over to the panhandle of Florida, where the water can really pile up, because as the water gets shallower here, as the bathymetry comes up here, well, now you're just piling the water higher, and then you get waves on top of that basically just destroy stuff, right? If it was just a very, casual rise of the water, you would flood kind of at a, reasonably, right? But then you get waves on top of that. That's what destroys everything. That's what Katrina did. So look at the central coast here. So Bay St. Louis, Gulfport, Biloxi, Pascagoula. The area below 10 feet is highlighted in yellow. That's 44,000 people and 22,000 homes, Alex. A lot of people in harm's way here.
Most certainly. So make sure you are paying attention. If you get any orders to evacuate, do that. Well, coming up on the show, New Orleans has a plan to keep the rainfall from flooding the city, but is it enough, or is the storm going to strain the system? We'll ask those questions next.
Here's my new dress.
Joining us, we have sped up the forecast and also intensified the forecast here moving forward. 40-mile-per-hour winds right now, moving northwest 14 miles an hour. So this is not going to have much in the way of land interaction moving forward. A little bit of western Cuba in play, but then getting out into those Gulf waters, very little shear, very warm water to work with. So we are anticipating a strengthening system. And we also know that the possibility is there that we could see a rapidly intensifying system. But right now, forecast is for a hurricane during the day on Saturday, becoming a high-end Category 2 hurricane by later Sunday, and landfall for the end of the weekend, very early Monday morning. We'll begin to see those impacts along the Gulf Coast as early as Sunday morning. Mike?
To New Orleans we go. We're in the cone, and so obviously there's going to be a heightened awareness of what could be coming our way, especially with a forecast of rapid intensification. We know in New Orleans we can be very vulnerable to all the different aspects of a hurricane, from wind to storm surge to rainfall flooding. We talked earlier here on Weather Underground. One of the big issues there is the pump system that's designed to keep the city from flooding. It does have some limitations. So joining us right now is Kelly Chandler, Regional Director of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. Thanks so much for being with us. You maintain the system there and decide, what is done with that, Kelly, when the time comes. Can you explain to our viewers at home how it works and what your concerns would be with something like Ida approaching?
Yeah, we start monitoring the storms when they're way out in the Gulf. We get storm surge predictions from the National Weather Service. We work closely with our partners at CPRA, the Corps of Engineers, and local and state officials. And based on the storm surge predictions, we start closing off the city and closing gates and preparing for the storm.
Now, Kelly, with a system that could, one of the scenarios is that the system comes in west of New Orleans, and that could, bring a significant storm surge into southeast Louisiana. But also, it might be relatively slow moving and drop a lot of rain. Are there pros and cons, or things you have to weigh to get rainwater out while also not letting the storm surge in?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for here in New Orleans. The longer the system sits over us and the more rain we get, the more challenging it is to get the rainwater out of the city and drained into the lake and into the Gulf. So we prefer a faster moving storm. But either way, we are ready for the storm. We have one of the most technically advanced storm protection systems in the world. And we are ready and are confident that the system will perform as designed.
It's a great system. Do we get to a point, though, where there could be too much water? At what point does it become a problem, even for the system?
It does get to be too much if the rain drops faster than the city can pump. But most of the time, the city will start pumping down ahead of the rainwater, and we will close off the cities to protect it from any storm surge.
Kelly, it's not an all or nothing, right? Like you can do certain parts of the city and not others, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. We close off the city based on what the predictions are and which way the storm is expected to make landfall, which side of the storm we're on. And so we can adjust accordingly.
And Kelly, could you explain to folks why it's called a hurricane risk reduction system, which I think is intentional, meaning it doesn't eliminate flood risk inside those barriers, right?
That's correct. No system can absolutely eliminate all risk, but the system is designed to prevent or reduce the risk down to a 1% chance. That means that there's a 1% chance each year we could have a 100-year storm. And so it is never down to zero, but it is greatly reduced since Hurricane Katrina. They've made amazing improvements in the system, and it's ready to go.
Because there's going to be 2 payouts. So ultimately, folks, here's the deal. We want to say specifically what you can find in certain cities here. And so what that could mean for a place like New Orleans is some really heavy-duty rain coming in. The forecast here, 5 to 6 inches of rain. What that means is you end up getting a system that may really test the limits of what our flood mitigation is, because our pumping system here can only max out at about 5 inches of rain total, all right? So that's going to be a real pressing issue, depending exactly where the track goes and how much rain we end up getting. A slower motion could produce more rain. Now we take a look at a place like coastal Mississippi or coastal Alabama, even over toward the panhandle of Florida here. 4 to 5 inches right along the coastline here, a little bit less inland, but still even north of I-10, we may end up getting some pretty heavy rain that could cause some flooding. And then we take you back west of New Orleans now. So if you're on the western side of this, you're likely to get less rain at this point. This is what the forecast is. But still in Lafayette, we're talking 3 to 5 inches of rain either side of town. Significantly less than as you go westbound on I-10. A 1 to 2 inch rainfall is generally manageable for a place like Beaumont or Lake Charles, Alex. But again, pay really close attention to the track of this. Small fluctuations can make a big difference.
Yeah, and you need to be ready to act should the order come in. And still to come on Weather Underground, new advisory in on Tropical Storm Ida. Our hurricane expert, Dr. Nav, is in to break it down, where it's headed, what's steering it as well.
Well, a terrifying landing in the middle of a thunderstorm that does not go as planned. Here's a peek at how Mayday air disaster unfolded.
After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up.
Put it down! Put it down!
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 90 miles per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room. At that point, I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
Mayday air disaster. It's coming up next, right after Weather Underground. Dr. Knapp?
Well, Mike, we have a new intermediate public advisory from the National Hurricane Center on Tropical Storm Ida because we have land-based tropical storm warnings up for the Cayman Islands and western Cuba. They're doing these intermediate public advisories, and this is not a complete update on the track and intensity forecast. That will happen right before 11 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Central Time tonight. No change on the intensity compared to the 5:20 p.m. update when the Air Force plane went in and found the 40-mile-an-hour winds. That's still the case. We'll have more aircraft missions overnight tonight to monitor the intensity as it's going through the northwestern Caribbean, and then certainly we'll have a lot of aircraft missions documenting the intensity all the way across the Gulf of Mexico, which is going to be critical because in a rapid intensification scenario, we've got to keep a very frequent update on how strong the winds are, how deep the pressure is. Now, there is one change worth noting here in this advisory compared to the previous one. It still says that the motion is to the northwest, but if you look into the details, the direction of motion has a little bit more of a west component than it did before. It was going at about 325 degrees, and now it's going about 310 degrees. And you can tell that little slight jog to the left compared to the previous motion because you compare where it is now relative to the 5 p.m. track forecast. You can tell that it would have to go back to the right a little bit to get back onto that particular track. So this could mean that there might be a little bit of a shift, at least in the short term, of the track a little bit to the left. But in any case, that's the only change that I could really notice of worth mentioning on the intermediate public advisory. In any case, it's going to be near hurricane strength when it's near or over western Cuba, and then a strengthening hurricane, perhaps rapidly at times, over the Gulf of Mexico. And you can't take it to the bank that it comes ashore with max winds at 110. I really hope it's weaker than that. It could be stronger than that. And the center coming ashore in the PM hours on Sunday, roughly speaking, but they can't pinpoint the time and location of landfall because there are still, options for it to go farther left or farther right by landfall. Look at the GFS ensembles compared to the main run. There are plenty of tracks that are to the west. I wish I could tell the fine folks in Lake Charles that are recovering from Laura, 1 year from that landfall last year tomorrow, that there's no way it's coming to you. I can't say that. It's within the realm of possibility. So is something that's farther to the east, coming ashore in Mississippi, maybe even Alabama, but a lot of tracks coming ashore in Louisiana. But this is not just going to be a point on the map or a line. It is going to be a large system and strengthening. And here's one thing I want to emphasize. You can look at intensity forecast models that explicitly put a number on the intensification. But you can look at the global models too. Watch what happens in the Euro model from Sunday morning. And then there's the GFS. That's a little faster. But then let's go look at the Euro. Watch what happens in the global model in the last several hours before landfall. That's a deepening storm all the way up to landfall. Never mind what the exact wind speed is. What it's saying is that the conditions are there for it to strengthen, perhaps rapidly, all the way up until the time of landfall. And then it only weakens in the GFS after it comes ashore. So with the winds of tropical storm force arriving likely Sunday morning, maybe as early as Saturday night, Alex, people have to be ready to change what they need to do on a moment's notice if emergency managers say, hey, this is getting stronger, we got to evacuate.
Absolutely. And Dr. Nab's coming right back after the break to break down all the factors that he will be watching into the end of the week and weekend. Stay tuned.
Ida became a tropical storm less than 3 hours ago, but it is just beginning its strengthening trend. And it could be a pretty strong tropical storm, maybe even close to hurricane when it's going over or near western Cuba over the next day or so. And then by Saturday, it's going to get into the Gulf of Mexico, moving northwest at 13 miles an hour. Well-defined steering currents, no doubt it's getting into the Gulf. Once it's there, the water is super warm, plenty of fuel, unfortunately, and the wind shear should be pretty weak. So all the indications are there for strengthening, perhaps rapid strengthening. The Hurricane Center, very aggressive with their intensity forecast. That tells us all that they have high confidence that this is going to be a strengthening tropical storm and then hurricane, and it'll be very near major hurricane strength or at major hurricane strength when the center comes ashore, maybe sometime during the day on Sunday, and then it's going to be a slow mover after it makes landfall. Not going to be moving all that fast. And don't make your plans on when to be ready based on when the center's going to come ashore, because the weather will go downhill before that. Tropical storm conditions arriving most likely Sunday morning, but if it speeds up and or the wind field expands, those conditions could get there Saturday night. And that's when you want to be done getting your supplies, evacuating, getting to your safe place to be during the storm. And because we are getting close to 2 days before those tropical storm conditions arrive, it's going to be later tonight or maybe early tomorrow morning that the Hurricane Center, the Weather Service, will issue hurricane watches and storm surge watches for some portion of the northern Gulf Coast. And when you look at how much this is going to strengthen and how large it will be and what a vulnerable part of the coastline it will be getting to, you can see why we're going to have such a storm surge threat. It might not be exactly here, but to the right of the landfall location, that's where the storm surge is going to be maximized, and you might be told to evacuate at some point here in the next day or two. As this comes ashore, you want to make sure you're not in the water, whether it's saltwater or freshwater, and that you are sheltering from the wind. So what can you be doing now to get ready for possibly being told to evacuate? Decide now where you go, how you get there. Ideally, you stay at a friend's home. And if you are a friend who doesn't live in an evacuation destination, find a friend who lives in an evac zone. Maybe you can be their inland destination. Consider medical needs for backup power. Consider pets. Don't evacuate vertically. It's going to be a busy few days. Stay with us here on the Weather Channel. Thank you so much for watching us here in Weather Underground. Remember, together, we know more.